Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
This is Daren Dochterman, and we are the Inglorious Treksperts.
See, I thought it was a classic femme fatale. Just so much fun.
Like that Shakespearean lace in your acting.
I said, Gene, what do you want from this character?
I want you to just take the character and make it your own.
I had a good time on the film.
On day one, the movie was already $15 million over budget.
We started this movie without an ending. That's like painting yourself into a corner.
I don't think we've ever had a Star Trek captain on our show.
Being, as you said, number one on the call sheet, it is a producer's position if you're going to take it seriously. I was so glad they didn't cast me as Lorca.
You famously wrote that script in 12 days.
On one level, I wrote the script, and on another level, the story was written by everybody and his brother.
New episodes every Saturday, wherever you listen to podcasts, or download the Electric Now app. Keep on trekking. Ingloriously, of course. Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
And this is Daren Dochterman, and we are the
Inglorious Treksperts. Although today, we're not Treksperts. We are Warspurts. I don't know.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
Are you well-versed?
And we're not.
Are you well-versed in the Napoleonic era? Are you well-versed in World War II?
No, that's but I'm one with the Force, and the Force is with me.
Well, how fortunate, how wonderful, because we are going to be talking about I know it's sort of like getting peanut butter in our chocolate, but we are going to talk about Star Wars today, and I'll tell you why.
Why?
Because, look, we've talked about this in 1977. We grew up on a little movie called Star Wars that changed our lives. Everyone knows, and everyone's talked about. But there's been a remarkable television show called The Clone Wars, which this week is coming to its conclusion. And I felt it would be remiss of us not to pay tribute to this remarkable show, because we've said in the past, they don't make them like they used to anymore. But this is a show that's just so brilliantly done, as was its successor series, Star Wars Rebels. But before we introduce our special guest, I want to welcome back our returning champion, the man, the myth, the legend. He is the writer of Thor and X-Men First Class. He's a TV producer, writer, who's worked on such shows as Black Sails, Surrey with the Fringe on top, Terminator, the Sarah Connor Chronicles, and currently working on a top secret show at a major streaming channel, which shall not be named. And that, of course, is Ashley Edward Miller.
Thank you guys for having me. I am very excited to be part of what I like to think of as a private little Star Wars.
And now for our special guest, but we're out of time. We're done. So we're very lucky and we're thrilled to have with us one of the great talents behind the Clone Wars, the story editor on the Clone Wars. He's a comic book writer. He's a TV writer, producer. He's done a ton of stuff outside the Star Wars universe. Some amazing shows, most recently Guardians of the Galaxy. He's working on a new top secret project, which we also cannot talk about, from what I understand, unless he wants to tell us. And he also was running part of the team that ran Star Wars Rebels. And we're thrilled to welcome Henry Gilroy. Hello, Henry.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm stoked to be here. I feel like I'm a little part of the heresy because Trek is part of the title of your show, and here I am, the Star Wars guy, but I'm excited.
You know what? We found the format is somewhat elastic. Daren and I had a little conversation. I really last year wanted to cover the 40th anniversary of the Black Hole, and Daren told me I was on glue, and I probably was. And nonetheless, I reached out to Robert Forster, hoping I could change Daren's mind. And Robert Forster said, I would love to do the show in a couple of weeks. And I figured that was enough time to convince Daren that we could do the Black Hole. Well, unfortunately, and it's not Daren's fault, Robert Forster then died. And so the Black Holes episode went away. But we sort of tested the water by doing an Aaron Gray episode where we talked about Buck Rogers early this season. And it was one of our most delightful episodes. Wouldn't you agree, gentlemen?
She was luminous.
It was my favorite.
It was great. So, with Clone Wars coming to an end, I just felt, look, there are a lot of Star Wars podcasts and people YouTubes and things, and I wanted to give it the Treksperts treatment. I wanted to, have a deep dive where we could talk, in depth about a show that, some people, maybe a lot of people in our audience aren't even aware of. They think, oh, it's a cartoon, right? They probably think, they don't realize that it is one of the most compelling pieces of Star Wars mythology to come down the pike since the original trilogy. So anyway, enough talking about how great it is. I want to start by asking you, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, your involvement professionally with Star Wars started when you adapted the Phantom Menace as a comic book. Is that right?
Yeah, actually, in probably about 5 years before that, I had started doing some small, short Star Wars stories for Dark Horse Presents and Star Wars Tales. And somebody at Lucasfilm said, hey, we should get the guy, who did the Star Wars Tales, but who also knows how to write a screenplay to maybe do the Phantom Menace adaptations. And it was funny because I think eventually that became the same reason how I got involved in the Clone Wars project was, hey, this guy knows animation, knows Star Wars. Why don't we bring in someone who can kind of help us put this together? So I'm very fortunate, to have been chosen by the producers, and then, George, approved me early on too. So
you were the chosen one.
You brought balance to the force. It's interesting because Phantom Menace sort of marked the beginning of spoiler culture in a sense, because back when we were young, when Star Wars came out, I mean, the novelization came out, what was it, 6 months, a year before the movie even arrived in theaters. The comic book came out before the movie, and so I think now everything is sort of under this cone of silence. Let's Get Smart reference for you oldies in the audience. And but the Phantom Menace, the first issue came out before the movie opened. So I mean, that's unthinkable now, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I asked actually that we push it back, and Dark Horse laughed because they go, no, we want to do as much sales as we can beforehand. That was a huge part of it. Another part of that, it's a little insider story, is I had been sent the Phantom Menace script. And it had my name, engraved on it or whatever, the watermark. And then once it was announced I was going to be doing the adaptation, like in 1997, I think, people started to try to find out where I lived. Fans wanted to know where I lived. So I was so paranoid about the script that I actually, before I left the house, I would hide it in the attic underneath the insulation. So I probably inhaled all sorts of like fiberglass particles, like getting the script out and putting it back in. But I was so paranoid once I heard that, oh my gosh, Henry Gilroy is adapting Phantom Menace. We need to find out where he lives so we can go. I figured it was harmless enough that they probably just wanted to, try to ambush me for coffee and get spoilers. But
or steal the script.
Or steal the script, right?
That's so funny because when I was writing the Bond book, John Glenn said that when they were doing Octopussy, it was that famous 1983, The War of the Bonds, and Never Say Never Again was like...
The director, John Glenn.
Yeah, the director, not the astronaut. And their production offices were actually very close. So one day, John Glenn left the script for Octopussy in the back of his car. And when he came back, it had been broken into and it had been stolen. And he says, I'm not accusing the people who made Never Say Never Again of stealing it, but it was very convenient. So,
oh my goodness.
But that's
a great story.
I mean, that's wild. Now, how did you just read the script, or did you actually get to see the film in advance? Were you seeing rough cuts? How did that work?
Yeah, I mean, they weren't letting any footage out at the time. So most of the materials we were giving with the scripts, a few storyboards, but mostly it was going to be still framed. Mm-hmm. And it was very important for George that the artist Rodolfo DiMaggio draw the characters to look like the actors. I think in previous adaptations, they aren't, as specific about it, but George, in his mind, he wanted the comic book to be the movie on a printed page. And I think because he was very happy with it. I tried to add thought balloons and kind of narration here and there, and he was like, no, just adapt the script. So
it's funny. I'm very good friends with Rodolfo.
Okay.
I've worked with him on several shows.
He's great.
He's great, and he's a brilliant artist, and I love his work in everything.
Yeah. You know, it's so funny when you look at how the Star Wars comics, which you worked on for quite a while, evolved. Because, of course, if you go back to the early days of the Marvel comics, you know, you had the Hoojibs, and there was no attempt to really, you know, tell, respect continuity or tell what is really a Star Wars. I mean, and it had the hyperbolic covers, you know, will Princess Leia survive the man-eating, you know, whatever. And it's pretty amazing how much like, you know, the shared universe has now taken over movies, how much more serious Star Wars got about their storytelling in graphic form.
Oh yeah, and I mean, and there were definitely, they talk about the different canons. You know, G canon was everything that George had done, which was the films, and then like the TV series stuff, and then everything else, the expanded universe, was everybody else. Although he would draw from it when he wanted to, whether it was in the Clone Wars or even the Phantom Menace, right? So yeah, he loved all Star Wars stuff. He would, I don't know, you may or may not know this, but he had the option to purchase any Star Wars comic book artwork first before anybody else. So his option was, if there was a cover or a page he liked, this is even after he sold the franchise, he was still buying, like, oh my gosh, I think Terry Dodson's work on the Han Solo book. Wow. He was just such a fan of the art. When you walk around his place at Skywalker, you can see that. You know, he's got a Frazetta cover or painting up on the wall, and
I wonder if that'll show up in the museum. You know, obviously the Lucas Museum, which will be opening. I don't know if it'll be next year now, but in the next couple of years down at by USC, it'll be interesting to see how much that stuff materializes. So excited about that. You know, I was thinking about the lead time, and I've told this story before, but it still vexes me to this day. But you know, back when these things were released before the movies opened, the Star Wars Super Special of The Empire Strikes Back came out before the movie opened. And I was in middle school at the time. And this kid, Lance Shulman, comes up and says, Mark, you got to see this. I got the comic of Empire Strikes Back. And I'm like, well, I don't want to see anything. He says, no, you got to see this one thing. And he opens it up. And I'm like, I am your father? He goes, yeah. And I'm like, I wanted to kill him. It's amazing that I didn't kill him. And I mean, to this day, I tell that story, and it still gets me angry.
You know, you can still kill him. You know, I'd be the first spoiler murder, right? I mean,
imagine that would be like the worst procedural episode ever, right? They're trying to figure out a motive and who could have done it, and it finally comes back to, and they're like, "What? No."
I almost 40 years ago.
I almost tried to track him down on Facebook and torment him. And but I didn't. I decided to be the bigger man.
He's our guest next week.
Inglorious Treksperts with Lance Shulman.
Daren, if you can make that happen, you know, ratings up.
You know, remember that show where it's like, this is your life, where, you know, where they would bring people and reunite them with people they knew growing up, and like Holocaust survivors who would be reunited with the people that, I mean, I could see Daren pulling this off.
Yeah. This is your death.
That's right. It's like Lance, you know,
Lance Shulman.
Oh my God. It's like cleaning woman, Lance Shulman. But anyway, even my kids know not to mention that name in my house, but it's been immortalized. Anyway, so you're doing the comic books. You had the success of doing the Phantom Menace comic, and now you get approached to do, as you mentioned, the Clone Wars, the most expensive animated series in television history, and ambitious, I would add. Tell me a little bit about how you were approached and sort of the initial stages of developing this for television.
This is always difficult. I think whenever you come to a series with a brand new studio, this is Lucasfilm Animation's first thing that they're going to try to do. Now, I'd been at Warner Brothers Animation in 1989 when they were just kind of relaunching with Tiny Toons and Batman the Animated Series. And also later on, oh my gosh, with the Hasbro and the Hub when they were starting off with Transformers Prime and G.I. Joe Renegades. So there was nothing. I think my first office was actually a copy room. So nice. Literally, I shared office space with a Xerox. because there was no infrastructure. I mean, we were just like 10 people just starting to try to get going. And I think there was definitely a perception early on that, this was going to be something Lucasfilm just knocked out, sent out. But I think once George got invested in it, and this is something that happened pretty early on too, where he said, you know what, I'll see you guys maybe, once or twice a year. I'm retired. He kept saying, I am retired. I'm not going to be involved in this really. You guys are just going to make this cool, animation thing, whatever. Dave and I very early on said, we can't do that. We have to make this thing as cinematic as we possibly can.
This is Dave Filoni.
Dave Filoni.
Yeah.
And so we committed to, like, in our mind, let's make bite-sized versions of Star Wars. So when we did our early renders, George was surprised. He was completely unexpected, I think, of what we were going to do. He goes, oh, you guys want to make cinema. Like, you're not going to just make a cartoon.
Right.
And so we went from maybe we'll see you once or twice a year to one meeting a week and then 2 meetings a week.
Wow.
So he would basically kind of drive up from San Rafael and want to sit down with us and talk, whether it was story and, review characters. He was just excited about it.
Mm.
And having him invested in it, I think, was really the best thing to happen to the show.
I've got a billion questions for you about that. So first of all, let's kind of scope the problem a little bit. When we say that the Clone Wars was the most expensive animated show ever made, so about how much an episode are we talking about?
Honestly, I don't know exactly.
Right.
And the reason why is, I think early on they were definitely aiming for a smaller amount to spend. But here's the problem: when you're starting up a studio and you're building the pipeline, and you're also building a pipeline for a CG show that's more ambitious than anybody.
Right.
I would be sitting in a room and George go like, yeah, and this week we're gonna go to 3 planets, and the producer would angle herself to sit behind him, and she would go like, one planet is all you get
For you,
right? And he would know what she was doing. He said, don't listen to her. You're going to 3 planets.
Wow.
And I think actually
it had to have an impact on the storytelling, right? Because you had to, number one, build up all of those assets so that you had them. I'm sure that put limitations on your ability to tell stories, whether George wanted you to have 3 planets or you could afford it or not, right?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Because we started off the series with, you have 9 characters. The good thing is you have clones and you have battle droids. And the great thing about clones was, people don't realize this, early on in the series, we only had 1 clone head, which was Rex.
Mm.
The first few episodes, Rex does not take his helmet off. You know why? Because we didn't have his head built yet. We literally could not afford to have clone heads. And then once you started to have clone heads, and you could give them different haircuts and facial hair or whatever. So the nature of a show like that, and in Rebels to a certain extent, where the bad guys are all in suits of armor. I mean, George did it himself in the original Star Wars. He only built 5 suits, right? And then reused them. So we definitely used every trick we could. But as time went on, George wanted bigger, more immersive stories with a zillion characters. And so the show definitely wasn't meant to be the most expensive show, Ashley. I think it was probably like, it'll be middle of the road. But I think the great thing about having someone like George who goes like, oh yeah, I want this to be bigger and better. And then the creative freedom that he gave us to actually write and do crazy stuff was really, it's inspiring. It's a kind of a dream come true to have that kind of a producer behind you.
I have a question from a fan here who did some research for me about the show. He wants to ask a question. So if you would be so kind to go ahead and
absolutely
ask your question. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Because you're the real war spurt.
He appears and disappears like a ghost. It's really eerie
right now.
Okay. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, so what was it like when you heard the Clone Wars was canceled and you were moving on to Rebels?
That's actually a great question. I had left Clone Wars before it had been canceled. So when I had the opportunity to come back and work on Rebels, I was pleasantly surprised because it would give me, hopefully, the opportunity to write those characters again. So I was sad on one hand that they didn't get the chance to finish the Clone Wars. But on the other hand, I was happy that there was going to be more Star Wars in animation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And also, what clones do you find the best creating?
Oh, it's funny. We were just talking about clones. That's a good question.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's 2 clones in the Ryloth arc, Waxer and Boyle, who I liked a lot. You know those guys?
Yes, some of my favorites.
Oh, awesome.
Who's your favorites?
Some of them. I still have a lot of favorites.
You like
Which
Fives?
One? Who do you like? Oh, Fives. Yeah,
I love Fives.
Steve Melching created Fives, Echo. I always have a fondness for Rex too. Captain Rex, I always loved.
He's always been there, main clone of the thing of the show.
Do you know what I have a question for you. Do you know his original name?
CT7567.
Oh my gosh. I'm amazed that you know that already. That's super impressive.
For CC.
That's my ex-wife's birthday and mine. So anyway.
That's funny.
But secondly, he had a name before that. And I originally named him Alpha. His name was originally Captain Alpha.
Like Alpha 17.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Yeah. He knows everything. So. And George.
Thank you for those great questions, Isaac. What, you got one more? Okay, we gotta move on. Make it quick. I got a lot more questions for Henry.
Yeah.
Although these are good.
Yeah, I just got one more. So, what Clone Wars arcs would we have gotten if the Clone Wars never was canceled? Because I know there would have been season 7 and season 8.
Well, you're getting a bunch of them right now.
Yeah.
I think there was. Gosh, you know what? I don't think I'm allowed to talk about those because they might show up in other forms, unfortunately. But what this means is there's more Clone Wars stories coming, probably.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, and here's the thing. Do you know where the name Rex came from?
No.
So George has this tradition of naming favorite characters after his dogs. And so he had a dog named Rex, and he named Captain Rex after his dog.
Nice. And of course, Captain Rex was the name of the droid in Star Tours that pilots the Star Tours speeder.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, the one that Paul Rubens gave the voice to. Captain Rex in the cockpit.
Wait, doesn't he... But they spell it like WREX or something, right?
Yeah,
it may be RX.
He always Rex.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay.
You know, I want to take you guys back for a second because you were telling the 3 planet story, and then you had the one clone. Now, for certainly for all 3 of you, you understand the challenges of working in animation. But I think a lot of people still think in animation, what's great about it is you can do anything, right? That's the misunderstanding. It's like, it's only as your imagination, wherever your imagination takes you. But the limitations...
Except give the characters heads.
Yeah, but
or let them walk.
There are so many limitations in cost. And can you explain, why it is that you're limited by budget and time? And of course, the challenge of the fact that what you're writing and recording, you're not actually seeing the animation in some case, not only months, but years later.
Yeah. Boy, that's such a huge question. I always liken it down to like when you're doing CG, something as simple in live action as cloth simulation. To try to do that in animation is extremely difficult. Like I can have a laser battle with characters flying around and shooting off the walls or whatever, but don't ask a character to take off a sweater. Right. Because it's so difficult to do the cloth simulation. So I think when people say, oh, you can do anything with animation, it definitely helps you tell fantastical stories and create aliens and create, I think, alternate worlds. There is something really powerful in animation in that. But for every CG character, someone still has to build that. Yeah. So that means that they have to design it, like Daren, and then we've got to model it and then color it and texture paint it and then rig it and then animate it. So that's every single character. So
and then change it because someone doesn't like it.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Like they don't even have heads, but somebody wants to change.
Right.
Like, there's so many things that we take for granted in live action. Like Aaron Sorkin would fail in animation because Aaron Sorkin likes to write walk and talks, right? You kind of put the action in there, they're blah, 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 blah. And they're, no, in animation, you know what's really hard? What's easy is a bunch of ships flying around or things flying around that I can't name, blasting each other and happening and blood spurting. What's hard is two having a conversation in a hallway. That's impossible. Like that's like, can they just stop and talk to each other just there and not be on the move? That's the kind of thing that that makes animation difficult. So the problems of it are just different. It's like Henry said, you know, it really opens you up in terms of what you can achieve in terms of design, and there are certain things in execution that you can do that are easy that in live action would be hard, but things that just feel like the simplest thing in the world in animation is it's moving a mountain.
Yeah. I mean, and even the subtleties in animation versus live action. If you're on a close-up of an actor's face, a human actor's face, and he says a line, let's say he's got a big block of dialogue, you will be compelled to watch that actor's face if you like it, because he's putting so much really subtle acting bits of emotion into that. You're never going to get that same connection with a CG puppet, basically, or a CG actor. Or you can, it's just usually not on a television budget. You might achieve it with a Pixar or something like that. So it's a different kind of storytelling, definitely. And you just have to be aware of it. I think the great thing about his animation is like Ashley was saying, you can do, it lends itself to cinematic storytelling, which is kind of like a larger scope, like you were saying, big things shooting at each other, whatever they are, which brings more spectacle. But it takes extra work to get those smaller, kind of more intimate moments. And we definitely tried to do that in Clone Wars a lot of times by, I don't know, just finding the emotional reality of the scene. I mean, and what's a better form for that, in my mind, than war? Telling war stories, I think, and George having the guts to go like, oh yeah, you want to wipe out this entire band of clones, you know, for this story, go for it. Where nobody would want to do that in children's television before Clone Wars.
And now this wasn't necessarily geared towards kids. I mean, it was being marketed towards kids and adults. But I do want to ask you, because we sort of glossed over this. Obviously, you talked about George Lucas sort of getting passionate about the show when he saw what you guys were doing. But tell us what it was like. Obviously, you grew up on Star Wars. George is sort of this legendary figure. What was it like when you first met him and found yourself working with him? And then also you have to get over being starstruck at some point and do the work, and you have to be willing to say, no, that's a bad idea. Can I pitch you something else? You know,
or did you ever get to that point?
I probably got in trouble for that. I mean, the great thing about George is he has like a 2 kicks of the can rule, where you pitch an idea, and if he says no, you have one more shot to go, well, here's why I think it would work. And if he says, oh, go try it, then you're good. Or if he says no, you never bring it up again.
Right.
And I think like somebody who's kind of come down the road and done as much as he's earned that. Also, he's your boss. So yeah, like the first meeting I had with him was really surreal, because it was like, great, you got the job, get on a plane, fly up to San Francisco. Like literally, it like had to get up at 4:00 in the morning, fly up there, literally walk in, arrive at Skywalker, walk into the Stag Theater. It's myself, Dave Filoni, and the producer, and you're going to screen Revenge of the Sith 2 weeks before it comes out, screen it, and then immediately go into a meeting with George and talk about what the series is. And you're standing there like, wow, that movie is mind-blowing. I just like a moment to process it. But you're sitting down with George, and he's like, oh yeah, you know, what do you guys want to do? You know, what is this animated series? So that was like a mind-blowing experience just to have that. I'm sitting watching this movie for the first time, and then 20 minutes later, I'm eating a salad next to George. I'd never met him before. So that was a fantastic moment. But early on, Dave and I made a commitment to try to treat George like he was just a human like the rest of us, you know? I mean, because if you think about it, it's like, man, the guy is responsible for modern cinema. I mean, never mind the Pixar and the non-linear editor and all of that stuff that he's responsible for, and genius and still sharp as a tack. He's just a guy, and he will react to ideas like all of us will. So on Fridays, when we would have our meetings with George, usually there were lots of what we call chickens running around with their heads cut off. George is coming. George is coming. And we used to make a joke like, the Emperor's coming here.
That's right.
Because everyone
always
was waiting.
Yeah. The middle management people freak out. And that happened when I was working on a Spielberg project. Same exact thing.
Yeah. And we couldn't react because it's like, okay, we have to go in there and be creative and pitch our ideas with confidence. And if he doesn't like them or whatever, I mean, I think probably for the first month, he would just make fun of us for being such Star Wars fans, you know? I remember one time I gave him a picture of a Nemoidian, and I go, "Oh, I wanted to make a Jedi this character," because a lot of times, like he would make fun of us for knowing the names of all the aliens, because you know some guy in Britain named all those guys. It wasn't me, which I always like. It always cracked me up. Anyway, so he looked at the picture, and it was a printout from the internet of a Nemoidian from, I think, the cantina scene, and he looked at the picture, and he looked at me, and he looked at the picture, and looked at me, and he goes, "You know what this is?" He says, "This is shit." And he crumpled it up and threw it in my face. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, did I somehow end up like in an abusive relationship with the most powerful filmmaker of all time? And then he like took it and he said, I gotcha. And he basically said, these guys are bad guys. These guys are bad guys. You don't make it one of the bad guys a Jedi. And I was like, oh yeah. So he was totally trolling me. And I was like, my face like was white.
So you're saying he's a racist? Is what you're basically saying now.
No. Terrible. You're terrible, Darren.
Clones look alike.
You had this huge canvas because basically at the end of Attack of Clones, you have, and the Clone Wars have begun, and then Revenge of the Sith, it's the end of the Clone Wars. So you have, and everyone's been talking about this literally since Star Wars came out, right? Since 77, everybody, the Clone Wars. And then they sort of exist off screen, and we never see them. So you have this giant canvas. How do you go about painting that? And at the same time, look, let's be realistic. They were very divisive films. Some people, they're their favorite Star Wars films. Other people, are not as fond, let's say, not as fond of those movies. So how do you go about sort of painting that canvas and figuring out what that show is going to be and what the sweet spot is?
It's funny. Originally, I had pitched a document that said, just for CG, we should do 4 episode arcs, like a one-pager. Because I figured that's the only way we'd be able to afford to make the show. Mm-hmm. But early on, George was like, "Oh, let's go over here and let's do this. I want to do an episode about that. I want to do this episode about that." And then that sort of kind of evolved back into the original thing I pitched. And I always, I don't know, my favorite war movies are kind of the war movies that influenced him, which were those 60s war movies, right? Mm-hmm. Like Battle of the Bulge, Force 10 from Navarone, like all of those, Bridge on the River Kwai, Lawrence of Arabia, all those movies that we loved, I know that he loved. And so I was basically thinking, okay, early on we'll do those stories, we'll do a bunch of war stories. But I think as the series evolved, it became a form to do all kinds of stories, like a femme fatale story, or to do, a science fiction story or a fantasy story or a story about terrorism. I think that's the great thing about Star Wars is, and especially the Clone Wars, during a time of war, you can tell stories that are probably every single genre. Because I think we did Westerns, you know what I mean? And besides just war stories and fantasy. So there's a whole
way it kind of became Star Trek. I mean, I'm not being facetious either. I actually mean that. I think one of the things that I've loved watching Clone Wars with my son, and we've binged it over the last few months until we finally caught up, is that it does have that Star Trek feel in the sense that, these stories can happen anywhere. Anything can happen. There are these people that we really love and we believe in who are at the center of them, wrestling very often with these moral questions. Like the adventure is great, the imagination is great, and I think a lot of that that kind of storytelling spirit really infuses the Clone Wars. It's one of the things I appreciate most about it. Although really my favorite episodes are whenever Bail Organa is on screen talking about banking regulations, I am riveted.
You're a liar.
Maybe a little bit.
I know you're a Tordarian fan.
Oh, hell yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the early days and the looking at the progression of the visual development? Because it, to me, it looked like you guys were trying to keep it from looking CG at any cost and making it look like it was, no, seriously, and making the backgrounds look just like a feature film.
Yeah,
they look very real, but the characters are very stylized and almost like puppet animation.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. I think that some of it had to do with, at the time, the limitations of a lot of CG, at least on a television budget, right, and schedule. But also there is, I think early on, we tried to keep some continuity, visual continuity with the characters with Gendy's Clone Wars.
Right.
If you look at the early Dooku design, especially, he looks a lot like Gendy's Dooku. And then when you put him next to Anakin, he doesn't really like work as well. And I think early on that was definitely, an issue. And I know, kind of just like I spoke before about the Clone Wars, not the Clone Wars, but the Phantom Menace and George kind of like having that memory of, wait, I want to see the actors. I think that definitely he wanted to feel the actors more in characters, especially like Anakin and Obi-Wan. Right. So when you put all of those characters together, there's definitely a difference in stylization. But also, Daren, at least in my mind, there's a level of McQuarrieism to that sort of language.
Sure.
Where there is a hyper-reality mechanical aspect to the backgrounds, but then there is a certain kind of stylized graphic quality to
almost painterly
the characters. To the characters. And that was definitely like, I think we did some early tests where we tried to take McQuarrie paintings and separate them into levels and like put them onto geometry just to see like how does that work. Right. And that was definitely a huge influence for Rebels. And I think why a lot of people thought Rebels looked warmer and felt lighter and happier, more optimistic, is because we definitely like had a stronger influence from McQuarrie and Rebels.
That's interesting.
Go ahead.
No, keep your thought.
Oh, just so you know, yeah, I mean, McQuarrie, Killian Plunkett, Tang Lee, those guys really brought the McQuarrie into the Clone Wars as well. And wherever we could, pay homage to him, we certainly did.
Yeah, I wondered. Go ahead, Darren. Go ahead. I hate Zoom. I hate it. Go ahead, Darren.
No, it certainly looks it, and I think that part of the way that it works is because the characters aren't being treated as photoreal humans. Because as soon as you approach that uncanny valley, it never works. It never works because the technology just isn't there to do that. And so I think stylizing them as you guys did, it works so much better. And having the backgrounds very hyper real as you did.
Yeah, I mean, when you also, it's funny. I think at the same time we were working on Clone Wars, I think in the Bay Area they were doing the Beowulf movie.
Yeah,
which kind of has that, like you're watching the zombie people walk around, and it's and if we could compare it to that, we definitely wanted to have our humans stylized, but the humans had to also be stylized because we're dealing with so many alien species.
Right.
And there's this weird thing that happens when you have a CG alien on the screen, you suddenly buy it. You accept it because it's not supposed to be human, so you're not comparing it to a human.
Right.
But we know what Anakin looks like. He looks like Hayden Christensen, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi. I mean, we know it's McGregor. So you're always going to compare that slightly to it. Anyway.
Which is why Mr. Arix looks so good in the Star. See, I'm bringing it back to Star Trek. That's why Mr. Arix looks so good in the animated series versus many of the actual actors. So I do want to ask you because, the show, when it begins, is much more swashbuckling, adventure, a little lighter. And as it goes on, much like the prequel trilogy itself, it becomes darker and darker. Was that a conscious a plan, or did that just evolve in the writing of it?
It definitely evolved in the writing of it. George would go through writers. I worked on the first season and a half, and then he brought in live action drama writers to work on the second season, and then another set of writers for the third season and fourth. And then he didn't even have a staff writer. He had, Filoni kind of in charge of the overall story, and then they brought in guys to work on scripts. A lot of writers from like 24 live action drama. So George definitely wanted that. Early on, he kind of wavered back and forth because he wanted to actually have it be fun. And they were definitely much more swashbuckling. Most of those stories, definitely, for better or worse, came from me because I always wanted to capture that swashbuckling from A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, right? So, but I felt there was definitely room for darkness, but not all the time because Star Wars is about hope. So I would always try to put some kind of positive thing going on. I think later on, showing Dark Jedi, or ordering their clones into, to their deaths, that kind of stuff. That's serious dark stuff, and I think that's the stuff that happens in war, and it's amazing. And I think it's a great evolution because I think the audience kind of grew up with the series. So for me, it was like perfectly acceptable. But I think also George always wanted to do new stuff. So, we did a lot of the swashbuckling stories early on, and then, he wanted to touch on stories that were definitely more adult, more mature.
Because by the time you bring Darth Maul back, I mean, that's pretty dark stuff with the witches and with Darth Maul. I mean, it goes to a pretty dark place. And Lucas would say, "Oh, this is a show for kids," but I clearly, it's not, just. I mean, that's why I think I wanted to do this show, because this is not just a show for kids; it's a show for adults and anyone who loves Star Wars. It's just great drama. So, was it interesting? And at what point did you decide you wanted to kind of bring back characters like Darth Maul? That maybe a lot of people were disappointed didn't get more love in the live action movies.
I think bringing back Darth Maul was after I had left, and the only reason I knew about it was it was late, like one night, and Filoni called me from his car on the way home, and he's like, I need you to write a comic book story. And I'm like, what for what? He's like, well, it needs to be a tie-in for what we're going to do for the season 4 or whatever. I'm like, what is it? You need to figure out how Darth Maul lived.
Right.
Well, he was only cut in half. So.
And I'm like, wait a minute. He's cut in half. George made sure that, he would see him split into 2 pieces, so there's no mystery. It's not
he put his Katra into Obi-Wan. Oh, wait, wrong. I keep mixing it up.
Forget.
So he said, write the story for how it happens, and then just have him end up here, because that's where he's going to be. It's like he's cut in half. Come on, the guy,
I really think
there's no way he survives.
I really think you missed an opportunity of just bringing his legs back, and just say, "Here he is."
It not only you bring him back, he actually spoke. I mean, he wasn't monosyllabic; he was non-syllabic, and then suddenly he's speaking like this. And it's just wow, okay, cool. I mean, I will say, Caden, whenever the logo for Clone Wars would turn red, because we knew it was a Darth Maul episode.
Yeah.
His eyes would just go, "Yeah, Darth Maul, Dad." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? Bail Organa is obviously not."
Well, let me ask you, because you mentioned, the comic books. In season 3, you got to adapt your own Slaver's arc from the comic book. What was that like? Where you're literally, and normally there's such a division between the licensed merchandise and the shows, but in this case, you're adapting your own work for canon.
Yeah, this is the weird thing, which was I had pitched that idea, and it was like, yeah, so a planet full of people get kidnapped and sold into slavery. And the producer's like, we can't produce that. It's impossible. And so, and I'm like, yeah, but I think the story is really, compelling because, it's Anakin. He's going to touch on all his like being a slave stuff and like, how did he mature and all that stuff. And she's like, okay. But I didn't find this out until later. She never showed it to George. So what happened was George saw the comic book after it came out and went, yeah, that's really good. Why don't we do this?
Oh, that's funny.
And so Dave called me for season 4 and said, oh, by the way, George wants to do your comic book. And so it was awesome. It was awesome. And those guys killed it. They did a terrific job. So, so I basically adapted the 4 comics into 3 episodes. I think, it was actually, I'm not sure I know of another experience of that happening on something that George worked on personally, where, he took something that was and kind of brought it into, something. I mean, he definitely brought in characters, I think, like Quinlan Voss and, who had bigger presences in the comics,
right.
Definitely Ventress, right. But so anyway, it was my pleasure to be a part of that.
And when, obviously the release of the movie, the Clone Wars movie, was a bit of a marketing gimmick. When did that come to your attention that they wanted to release a movie? And, what were your feelings about like the fact that it was going to get, theatrical release before the show debuted?
I was horrified, actually. And the reason why was those first 3 episodes were the very first thing we produced. Mm. And as you were saying, Daren, the designs evolved as the series went on. They definitely got better. And subtlety in acting, effects, just we were allowed to do, I think, as far as locations, characters. I mean, all of it was one of those things. And most people don't know this, and maybe you guys do, but it was definitely what I call the Castle series, were 3 episodes, and then I think episode 22 was engineered to go on the front of it to be the first 22 minutes. So it wasn't really, in my mind, a film so much as it was like 4 chapters. Mm. However, when you look at it, I think there's some amazing work in it, and I don't want to diminish the work of anyone, but I think from a storytelling point of view, I was so kind of horrified because I was like, oh crap, this is supposed to be 3 chapters, not 3 chapters with a new prologue. That makes sense. Right. So, but I know when you look back on something, I think we've all looked back on our work and went, oh, I wish I could do that thing again. That's definitely, I think, the feeling.
Especially George does.
I don't think so. He was really happy with it.
No, I'm talking about his early work.
Oh,
the early funny ones. So I'm wondering about, it's funny because we talk about the first couple episodes. I don't think there's any showrunner or creator or writer that would ever point to their first couple of episodes of the TV series as their best. I mean, I don't know, maybe Lost, but I mean, it's so rare that, obviously you're finding the show, it's always tough. So the idea of like releasing your first couple of episodes, it's completely understood.
Oh my gosh, you are absolutely right. It's funny. It's like, I think the first Clone Wars episode to air was the Yoda one, and that was episode 6. I have this theory. Usually you start to figure out the show around episode 5 or 6. Right. And it was definitely that way on Rebels. I think on other shows I've worked on too. So,
yeah, my show, it's 23. I've almost got it.
Well, and especially given how much R&D you had to do, because you really were inventing the wheel, as you said, starting an animation house from scratch and, pushing technology. Yeah, the first couple episodes, there's no way those are going to be your best episodes. There's no world in which that's going to happen.
Yeah, when you look at episodes, from that, 4th season, 5th season, wow, there's some amazing work as far as the scale, subtlety of acting, staging, the lighting. Those guys really got it down. And I think having someone like George behind it who basically said, yeah, we're going to push it and we're going to do these adult stories, I think there's one, I think I'm allowed to say this. I think there's one really great scene in a Ventress story where she she's fighting clones, and she stabs a clone in the chest, and then I think in the Cartoon Network version she pulls the sword out and walks away. I think in the uncut version she stabs him in the chest and then kisses him on the mouth or something.
Yeah.
Okay. and I think it was one of those things where, Cartoon Network was afraid to, or was, trepidatious about asking George to make a cut. He's like, yeah, I don't care, because we're just going to put out the DVDs and that's what people are going to want to enjoy the series. Because he was thinking about the long game of,
Right,
you know what,
sure.
people are hopefully, we're going to make this show great and people are going to watch it for years and years and years. And he is absolutely right.
Yeah.
So even the Clone Wars had a special edition. So I have a question about the other side, right? Not just the visual design of the characters and the world, but the performances, the casting. Because one of the things I most appreciate about the show is that the acting on it is really quite excellent. And one of the bars I think that your actors have to overcome is that they're not just being themselves, right? They're doing a little bit of karaoke, right? Like weirdly, the actor who's playing Obi-Wan Kenobi is doing his imitation of Ian McGregor, doing his imitation of elegance. And yet he is compelling. The actor who plays Anakin Skywalker is okay. Let's just say that he's a little better than Hayden Christensen. But my God, then you look at somebody like D. Bradley Baker, who in one arc of episodes plays he carries 4 episodes as the clones, right? 6 or 7 different clones. They all basically look alike. It's dark. And yet he manages to infuse in each of them a very specific personality in spite of the lack of vocal separation. So I can only imagine that the casting process for you guys on this show was, I can't even get my head around how tough that must have been.
Yeah, actually, all of that. Can I just agree with you?
I love when people disagree with me. Ask my wife.
You're absolutely right, and I think that's one of those things where initially we did bring in someone who was doing Hayden Christensen for the first little bit, and it didn't work out because we wanted the kind of hero, but also someone who had the warmth of who George wanted Anakin to be. And I think Matt Lander, man, that guy is amazing. God. He brings it because it's even though he doesn't sound exactly like Hayden, he really embodies Anakin. And you're absolutely right about James Arnold Taylor doing Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's fantastic because you're absolutely. I don't know if it's been said, but the way you kind of distilled down, he's doing it's one of those things where he just is the character. But then James is so versatile, he's also Master Plo Koon at the same time. Right. And several other characters. He's extremely versatile. That's very important in animation too. Ashley was one of those characters and I think actors that was a little tougher because we really wanted someone who had spirit, but yet they had to sound young, and not young necessarily physically, but just new to the galaxy. And our entire point of view and approach in telling the Clone Wars story was, we know what happens to Anakin, Obi-Wan, Mace, everybody, Yoda. We know what happens to them. This one character, we don't know what happened. Is she going to live? Is she going to die? She was really our Luke.
She's the one character in that show truly who is new to the audience, and who before she arrived on your page didn't have an existence. So, I mean, was it a part of the process for you? Did Ashley's performance help you find who Ahsoka was? Did that performance help you unlock things about her relationships with other characters? Like, how did the performance help to grow Ahsoka as we know her?
I think every day. I think it was part of it had to do with a lot of times actors come in and they are not really familiar with all of the intricacies of the lore. So the fact that she didn't know every detail, she had seen the movies, but she didn't know all of it. And I think we did one of these weird things where we used fake names, when we were casting it. You're going to do the character for Zeb Starkiller, and it was Anakin or whatever. So we definitely played that. And when we told her, like, you got the part for this new character, you know, she's going to be kind of the star of the show, she was like, oh, cool. You know, like, she didn't really realize it. And part of that was kind of awesome because then she could grow into the role. And I think bring the light of, like, you know what, here is this young person. She's 13 years old. She's grew up in a temple on Coruscant, hasn't really seen the world. And then she's thrust on the front lines of a war, going from planet to planet. And that's something that we wanted to do for our audience, was introduce the audience to the galaxy through Ahsoka's eyes. And with every episode, the more that Ashley, you know, brought life to this character, we began to kind of feel the experience that she was getting as she was kind of interacting with Anakin and Obi-Wan.
I got to say, that has to be pretty gratifying for you, because when Ahsoka was introduced, there were a lot of people, there was pushback, who didn't like her. You know, they didn't like the character. And now she's probably the single most popular character in the franchise. I mean, you have all these people who are, you know, screaming for her to be a live action character. They were begging her to be in Rise of Skywalker. Now she's going to be in Mandalorian, but it's to be gratifying that you create this character that just becomes, you know, a fan favorite and is right on par with, you know, Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker and, you know, Mace Windu and all these legendary characters.
It's extremely satisfying, and also just the inspiration, I think, to a generation of young women who were inspired by her. And I didn't realize it. Also, before I start about the good stuff, I'm going to give you the bad stuff. I don't know who the a-hole is who wrote the August 2008 version of Entertainment Weekly. He wrote an article, like, the 10 worst characters in Star Wars, and Ahsoka was
Lance Shulman.
Oh,
Yeah.
But I never forgot that, because I'm going like, oh man, you have to give her a chance and let her grow into the character that we know she's going to grow into, because she can only grow up into be this amazing character with Obi-Wan and Anakin, you know, between the two of them. So yeah, it's extremely gratifying, and I'm super excited. I didn't really realize it until I think I saw the season 1 finale of Rebels, when Ahsoka returns.
Spoiler!
Sorry. Spoiler alert.
You've had plenty of time.
Okay. And somebody sent me a reaction video of all these kids screaming and crying and running around and jumping up and down, and you're like, oh wait, that's right. She was a character that was super important to it, like this second generation of Star Wars fans. So yeah, extremely gratifying, and I feel very fortunate to have been part of creating her. Absolutely.
It's funny. The other day, I went up to my son. He was really upset, Isaac, who asked you those questions, and he says, "I said, well, you know, why are you so upset?" And he goes, "You know, well, Clone Wars is ending next week." And I said, "I know, but you got all these extra episodes, and I know you're upset that." He says, "It's not. I'm not upset that it's ending. I'm upset that Anakin is becoming Darth Vader, because I love Anakin so much." And it was like. And you know, he loves Darth Vader, but he's so, you know, Matt has done such a remarkable job with Anakin. I mean, you look, it's no secret, I'm not a fan of the prequels, but man, I love him and I love everything about Clone Wars, you know. So it's really remarkable, and I just thought that was wild, that was his feeling, knowing how he feels about Darth Vader. I mean, he just figured, you know, finished building Darth Vader's castle Mustafar at a Lego, and so I mean, I'm like, what's wrong with Darth Vader? Anyway, but look, before we wrap up, we got to talk about Rebels, which we're giving short shrift to, and it doesn't deserve it because it's a remarkable show. Tell me what happened when, you know, you're basically asked to do it again. It's like, we're going to do it again. We're going to do Rebels now. We're going to do another show. And, you know, Clone Wars had become this critically acclaimed show. The fans loved it. People loved it. Now, you know, hey, we're going to do it again, and you're going to have less money, and you have less time, and, you know, and all this. And it's like, and, you know, and it's as good, if not better, than Clone Wars, in my opinion. So what do you tell us how you did it, or what you thought?
Oh, I mean, I feel very fortunate, you know, Simon Kinberg, Dave, Carrie, they brought me in season 1 to help with the writing. And it's one of those things where, because I had never really stopped thinking about Star Wars. So I was just ready to kind of step in and continue working on it. And I think we knew we were making a show for Disney. This was after Disney had purchased Lucasfilm, so there was a little bit of like I think certain uncertainty, like, hey, you know what, we should probably bring in guys who we know can make this show. And I think there was a false start, you know, with the first writer they brought in. So it was like, can you come in and because I had a rapport with Dave in telling Star Wars stories, it was easier for me to just hit the ground running and go with it. So that was definitely part of it, but I never stopped thinking about how to make a Star Wars story. And I think that's the key, is people go like, well, what is that? Like, what is a Star Wars story? What is that to you? And I always like look back and I go, okay, besides like the historical sources that George draws on, it's like this stew of his favorite cinema. He is a kid who grew up right in the 50s and 60s. So yeah, it's 2 tablespoons of cereal, right? Serialized Flash Gordon, with some Westerns and a samurai, right? And mix in some war movie. All of that kind of adds up and feels like Star Wars. And it's not something that I think a lot of people try to imitate it. They try to capture it, but it's not something that's easy to write. You have to think about it. And I know you guys are huge fans, and probably the same thing for Star Trek. What makes that Star Trek story feel like a Star Trek story? So much.
Don't try to steer us back into Star Trek.
Because then we can give you examples of things that don't feel like Star Trek stories, and then we'll get in trouble with many of the listeners.
So my biggest, I'll tell you this one thing. My biggest response to, and Disney was super supportive of us. My biggest response to like the notes I would get was, I'm not making a Disney branded show, I'm making Star Wars. Right. And that was sort of like my end all, like, I'm not going to take that note because I have to be true to what a Star Wars story is, not something else. And that, I think, was, having the support of the folks at Lucasfilm and the immense talents from the animation, the color and design. Everybody is really united in making this one thing great. And it always shows up on the screen. You see it.
And isn't that the triumph of that show? So many people had a chip on their shoulder about it because they were upset. They felt this was the show that killed Clone Wars and that Disney was going to kidify it. And then you basically showed them all how it was done. You said wrong. And, Rebels came out, and the same people that were attacking it and hating it fell in love with it, and I think, again, it's another triumph.
Yeah, I think when you have to fight a little, it helps you. I think there was an early bit of like marketing work that had Ezra riding Chopper like a skateboard, and I go, I never want to see that again.
Right. Yeah.
Because I go, that's the Poochie of it. And I go, someone's going to look at that and go, oh, he's Space Aladdin. It's like, no, that's not what we're doing. And eventually they came around, and towards the end, it's like, whoa, you guys have taken this show just to heights we never imagined. And I think I wish more outlets would do that. Go, wait, we hired you guys, storytellers, not necessarily on Star Wars, but whatever, to come in and make this great show. Let us make it.
Amen.
Well, look, I think I'm so glad we did this episode. I don't know if some of our Star Trek fans are as glad as I am, but I think this is fascinating, and congratulations on a remarkable run with both these shows. And I'm sure there'll be many in the future. And can you tell us what you're working on now, or is that much like Ashley, classified?
Unfortunately, it is classified. I can't talk about it. I'm hoping they'll talk about it soon, but until then, I can't. So
great.
It's Poochie, thank you so much for having
me. It is Poochie. Dang it! How did you know? But thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you guys. You guys are awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Henry. Oh, it's always good to see you, even if it's virtually. And thank you, Ashley, for joining us once again. And to everyone out there, all you people out there listening to Inglorious Treksperts, thanks for joining us for another episode. We'll be back next Saturday with an all-new episode. And if you just can't get enough of us talking about Star Trek and Star Wars, you may want to download the Electric Now app, which is now in your favorite app store, where you can not only listen to your favorite Electric Surge podcasts, you can watch them. You can see us. that's scary, I know, but it may be interesting for you. I don't know, but download Electric Now at your favorite app store, and in addition to all your favorite Electric Now podcasts like the Inglorious Treksperts and the 430 Movie and the Rebel and the Rogue and the great Best Movies Never Made, you can also watch great stuff from the Electric Library like The Librarians and The Outpost and a ton of really great movies. Can
I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
But obviously, besides Filoni as the chief storytelling partner on Star Wars and Rebels, I couldn't have done it without my writing partner Stephen Melching.
Never heard of him.
Just I just heard a bunch of lies he's told on your Galaxy Quest podcast. So I don't know, that guy. He's full of crap.
Like, Steve's the best. He's super talented. Obviously
he's always prepared.
He's very prepared, like a good Boy Scout. We're so happy for him. Obviously we're all privy to what he's doing right now. It's so great to finally see, that the learner has become the master. The Padawan has become so we're all so happy for him. He's such a great guy. Couldn't happen to a better guy. And I know you had a lot to do with that. So that's fantastic. And again, we'll see you next Saturday here on Inglorious Treks. Right? Is that what I say, Daren? I don't have the script in front of me. I say something like,
I think that's close enough.
I say, keep on trekking,
right.
Ingloriously, of course. And then you say,
and I go,
shh. And I say, engage. Or I should say, for this episode, may the Force be with you. Until next week.